More more than a decade ago, the university, the Georgia Tech asked me if I would run a task force for the university, and it was called the Innovation Task Force. And it's the sort of thing that when you get to a certain point in your life, when people ask you to do this, you're smart enough to say no. And I said no. Uh, but the fellow who asked me to do it was a guy named Steve Cross, who was our executive vice president for research, and I ended up saying yes, but in order to say yes, I said to him, look, no matter what we do, people are going to not want to do anything after we figure it out. And I said, what I would like to do is I'd like to have everybody on campus who could ever possibly say no to us on the task force, on the theory that at the end, everybody will think for a moment that it was their idea, whatever it was we were going to do next, and they wouldn't kill it right away. That that's a good strategy, by the way. It has the disadvantage of things that you could probably figure out in a month take you a year. So we spent a year uh, shepherding this group forward, at the end of which, well, part of the problem was to say they wanted us to figure out what we could do about innovation. And first, you have to figure out even what do you even mean by innovation. And so we ended up thinking innovation meant the following. Um, People have an idea, they see something they want to go about accomplishing, they see something in the world that they want to make better, and they go about trying to make it better, and then it actually happens. The opposite of that is what almost always happens, which is people start with something that they want to see happen, or they want to fix something, and they go and work on it, and then nothing happens. Usually, the way nothing happens is they find themselves either getting it's overwhelming to them, or they get bored of it and they stop, and then the thing that whatever the innovation was stops, or they have some funding source, and eventually the funding source gets bored, and then things stop. So if nothing else, I can say already, I would say we had to come to some understanding of what it meant to have a successful innovation. And I'll say, for me, what a successful innovation is it's one in which you start, you have yourself or a group of people, you're trying to make something happen. And even when you get tired of it or the money runs out, it continues. That is, it somehow gets drawn into the world. And so it actually exists. And that's what we meant by successful innovation. Uh, Almost everything I'm going to tell you, I'm going to say I've had a lot of experience. I think the reason that that Steve Cross called me up and asked me to do this was because at this point I had already started 7 companies where I was the CEO, and sometimes my ideas, sometimes other people's ideas. We had all sorts of different outcomes. Um, the uh, but none of the things I'm going to tell you, I'm going to share with you some of the pain that I experienced, and but none of these things are the kinds of things that I think you can think of in advance. They're not the kind of things that anyone, I'm certainly not smart enough to have said in advance, we figured this out and then we went and executed. It goes the other way, which is things go wrong and then you try to figure out why things went wrong. And if you do it enough times, I'm somewhat convinced that you have people get to a certain level of a sense of what's working, what's not working, and why. And a lot of times when I talk to people about these things, I find myself thinking a lot of what I'm doing is giving a name to things that people already know, but we didn't necessarily have a name for. And so I'm hoping that some of these things relate to you and experiences that you yourself have had, and that might be the most use for that you'll have for this. Um, we did write a book. Let me see if I can get this to it. We did write a book. I can recommend the book to you. It's stories. We tried to make this stuff accessible. It, I having started the projects that we started, having started Flashpoint and this the work, it was really focused at the time because I don't think I knew any better on the puzzle of how do you get startups to be more successful. And it turns out in retrospect, what we were trying to figure out with startups is really much more general than it was with startups. Working with startups is in some ways gave us a chance to work on something in a very pure way. That is, a startup is like one person or a small number of people, and they basically have nothing. There's no institution around them, there's no money around them. And so the puzzle that I've come to realize that a startup is trying to solve is the puzzle of how do you start, in some sense, from nowhere and find a way to become of value in the world. In some ways, that's what it means for innovations to be successful. It becomes of value. How do you know? Because the world adopts it. And the things that we paid attention to, trying to figure out what to do with startups, I came to realize are applicable not just in the startup setting, but it's applicable in any setting in which people are trying to become of value. So actually, not just it's a good idea, but it's a good idea, and somehow these things actually work out to get pulled into the world. Um, Okay, so that's and so the book actually is has stories in it which aren't just about startup stories, but there are also stories about innovation from in large companies and also in nonprofits and even individuals doing innovation. The let me start. Let me see if I can meet you where you might be, and say I've come to think about what an innovator is. What does it mean to even be interested in innovation? And I like this way of thinking about it, which is to say a person who feels as though they're an innovator, could be a startup person, it could be someone who's trying to innovate in the world, is a person who feels called in some way to a place where their deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So what do I mean by this? Well, if the world wants you to do something and you don't care to do it, that doesn't feel right. And if you feel like doing something and nobody cares that you do it, that doesn't feel right either. Now, that's of course not entirely true. I think artists sometimes can create without caring whether anyone likes their art. But I think for people that are trying to be of value in the world, the place that doesn't feel right is when you want to do something and nobody else cares, or when people care and you don't want to do it. But what it feels right is when you're in the sort of intersection of those two circles. That is what you're drawn to do, because not doing it doesn't feel right to you, is also something which other people feel drawn to have you do, that it's not okay for them for you to not do it. And I hope that resonates with some of you, and because that's where I would like to start. So I want to start by telling a story. I'm going to just share with you some of my own pain. Sometimes it's easier to understand this way. Um, when when I first came to Georgia Tech, it was quite a while ago now, just after the dot-com crash and I was living in San Francisco before that. Uh, some professors came up to me, two professors and a graduate student came up to me and they said, "We know you do startups. We have an idea to how to find all the bots on the internet." And I slowed them down and I said, "What do you mean by bots?" And they said, "Well, there are these people are getting malware. They're getting software onto other people's computers, and that causes the computers to be under the control of somebody else. So if you have a computer on your laptop or desk, someone else could have software on it, which is allowing them to control your computer." And something had changed in this time frame. It's quite a while ago now, but what had changed was it went from being a game that young people were playing, I guess teenagers were playing, to being something where people could commit fraud and crime at a giant scale. And in the former Soviet Union, there were quite a people that were called bot masters that were getting software distributed across the internet. In fact, at the time, our estimates were that about 17% of all computers on the internet were infected with this malware, which meant that they were under the control of a bad guy in Europe. And there were all sorts of things you could do with these things that made them dangerous. And these guys came to me and said, "Well, they think they can find all the bots. They can identify whether a machine has is under the control of a bad guy, and they think that we should build a business around it." And I've done enough startups, and I said to them, "Well, you don't really have a business unless you have a customer." And by the way, I apologize. I'm going to give you stories. Some of these stories will often be from a business setting because that's where we first discover them. But map them into the thing that makes sense for you and the work that you're doing. I think they're of universal meaning. So I said to these three guys, I said, "Okay, but let's go figure out if there's any customers, if anyone ever would ever pay for anything that we might build." It's one thing to say you can find all the bots, but who would care? And they told me that they thought eBay would care. And I said, "Well, why would eBay care?" And they said, "Well, here's what they're pretty sure was happening at eBay. There were bad guys that were starting to control computers all across the world. And these bad guys would set up a fake website that would sell high-end cameras. And they would list that website on eBay. Then they would send their bot army to have all these computers which were under their control to come to that website and buy cameras, or at least act like they were buying cameras, and then give successful ratings to that fake camera site until the camera site became a platinum seller. At which point eBay would start to promote that site. Real people would come to the site, send $10,000 to the site to get a camera which would never arrive, and that they called trust fraud. So it was a type of fraud. And they thought that this might be a really big deal for eBay. And it turns out that I knew the chief information security officer for eBay, a guy named Howard Schmidt, and we were on some boards together. And I called him up and I said, "I think these guys have got something. They think it would be valuable for you at eBay. Could we talk about it?" And he said, "Yes." And so I flew out west and had a meeting with the folks at eBay, with him and his folks at eBay. And as I'm describing to him what this about trust fraud and about how these guys, this software that or their technology might be able to stop these bad guys from creating these sites. He called in some people and they like were working on the whiteboard behind us, and they said, well, this would save us about we think it'll save us about $40 million a year in fraud. So it turns out that if people bought fake cameras and then you told eBay about it, they would refund your money in order to keep the community safe. And so at that point, Howard turned to me and said, okay, how much would it cost? So we had nothing at the time. And I didn't know, first of all, it's amazing to me that they thought they could right away say that it was going to save them $40 million. I said, I don't know. I made up a number. I said $150,000. I said that because I thought to myself, okay, we're going to sell these things to corporations. That means I have to hire salespeople, and I figured we could do it for almost nothing. $150,000. And when he didn't balk, I said to start. And when he didn't balk, he said to me, I said, maybe I should go home and make this. And he said, yeah, go home and make it. So I flew back to Atlanta, and my partner and I were going to put in some money ourselves. We decided instead to run around and see if there may be some venture capitalists that wanted to invest in this. And I pitched 6 VCs, and I got 5 term sheets like overnight from first tier VCs. And I went to these other guys and I said, okay, let's make a deal. And we raised money, and I started negotiating with the university to get the intellectual property. You have to understand at this time at the time we raised $2.5 million on nothing, which nowadays you might be easier, but back then it was quite a bit more difficult. And I started negotiating with the university to get the intellectual property out of the university. There were no employees. So I hired a CEO. The first job I had was to replace myself as CEO, raise this money. 6 months go by, we build the product, or the company builds the product, and I fly back out and I talk to Howard about it and I show it to the folks at eBay, and they say, that's really cool, and then they don't buy. And I don't know why they're not buying. I went home and said they asked for this feature, they want to have this integration, let's do that, and they still didn't buy. And I'll tell you that for many months, in fact, I think never, uh, our board meetings would start with, well, has eBay bought yet? And the answer was always no, eBay hasn't bought. And here's the thing that I want to say. Everything that I explained to you was true. Everything that happened was exactly as it happened, more or less. So it really would save them $40 million to install this software, to use this software. It really would cost them $150,000. It really did work. And here's the big insight. In that conversation, in that interaction, there is nothing that they said or that I said or that we did or that they did. There's nothing in that interaction that should have led me to think that they would ever buy. And that's really puzzling. I don't know if you find that puzzling, but I want to say that most people who are doing innovation find themselves feeling like they're in some sort of maze where they know there must be a way out, and it's all completely confusing. If you've done an innovation, I wonder if the world feels like this to you. It's like they're asking me to make it integrate with this. They're telling me that it's saving $40 million. I've made it so that it actually does the thing that they say that it's going to do, and they're still not buying. And then the investors are asking me, why aren't they buying? And then the product people are running around trying to make changes to things, and I'm still not out of the maze. It's an incredibly uncomfortable position to be in. It will save them $40 million. It does work. It does cost $150,000 and they don't buy. And nothing in that interaction should lead me to think that they're going to buy. And I'll tell you why. I mean, here's the big insight. The big insight is, people don't really understand why people do anything, but I can tell you this, the right question to have asked would have been something that sounded more like, hey, Howard, if we have this and it would save you $40 million, would it be possible to not buy? Would it be okay to not buy? I mean, I can see why it would be good to buy, but I'm wondering, is it okay for you to not buy? Because I'm pretty sure what he would have said to me was, oh yeah, we have lots of ways to save $40 million and we don't buy those either. Okay, so that's a big insight. And I want to tell you that a lot of what happened when we started this project called Flashpoint at the university was to make the following intellectual bet. And the intellectual bet was, maybe there's something which is universal and common among all people who try to do innovations that causes almost all innovations to fail. Now, of course, some innovations succeed, but the vast majority of innovations fail. And I made an intellectual bet, which I can explain to you more easily now, having gone through this for a long time. And the intellectual bet was we know that human beings make errors in judgment in situations of uncertainty. This is work that Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for. It's work that he and Amos Tversky started the field several decades ago that's been really developed. In situations of uncertainty, people make errors in judgment. I thought at the time, I've worked with a lot of founders. I've written checks to young people working, and I tried to work with them, and they all seem crazy to me. They all seem to believe that what they were doing was going to for sure work, and it often didn't work. And I couldn't convince them one way or another. And I thought, well, maybe they're all crazy. But now I'm thinking maybe they're just all making judgment errors. And I don't know of it. I don't know of many situations as uncertain as the situation in which you're trying to do an innovation. So if you make errors in judgment in situations of uncertainty, why wouldn't it be the case you're making errors and people are making errors in judgment in the context of they're trying to make an innovation happen? And if you dig into what that might mean, as I've come to understand it, it might mean this. It might mean that you're making judgment errors, which are basically biases that are built in that you're not noticing that you have, and that these biases may cause you to think that the world works in a certain way that's not the way the world actually works. And you don't notice it because the biases are judgments, and judgments, the kind of errors you make in judgments are you don't notice you make them. That's sort of the point. Like if you knew that you were making a judgment error, if you knew you were making an error, you would try to correct for it. But the problem with judgment errors is you just think you're right, so you don't even think to check whether you're wrong. And what if, I wondered, what if it's the possibility that the biases that we're all living with, which are these errors in judgment, are somehow causing us to imagine that we live in a world that's not the world we live in. It's almost like we live in some sort of waking dream version of the world. And then we go and make things and build things and introduce things. But we introduce things that would definitely work in the world that we think it is. Like I'm thinking that if you make something which costs $150,000 and it would save people $40 million and they're your friends, that they're going to buy it. But what if that's a waking dream? And we started to look into, well, what are the mechanisms? That is, what is the mechanisms by which people have these biases or by which these waking dreams are constructed, which cause people to skillfully cope with the world, but it's not the world as it is, it's the world as they think it is. And you start to realize that for the most part, it doesn't matter because the world is somehow constructed so that even though we're biased about how we think about it and it's not really how it is, nothing really hurts us. But in some contexts, it really matters to notice that the world isn't the way it is. We know that for sure if you're doing physics, you can't just like it sure seems like heavy things should fall faster than light things. And if you ask people 2,000 years ago, 200 years ago, they would all tell you heavy things fall faster than light things. But that's just not true. And you might have to do something to go figure it out. And when you go figure it out, your intuition might still be that heavy things fall faster than light things. But the truth is, heavy things and light things fall at the same rate. And I wondered whether something like that might be true in the context of innovation, an area which we have not up until now thought might be an area in which we have to put in place some mechanisms which help us protect ourselves from these biases, like we've long since figured out we had to protect ourselves from, let's say, in medical research or in physics research or in chemistry research, where human biases cause you to think that things like bleeding people is going to work, when in fact bleeding people doesn't actually work. Although it is true that when you bleed people, sometimes they get better. And therefore, if you don't know how to do experiments, you might think you got to keep bleeding people because even though you don't know why it works sometimes, you still think you got to do it. Okay, that was the sort of context for all of this. So let me just dig in and take you down one path, sort of the central path. It's a path that's very much explored in the book, which is why I want to recommend the book to you. It's the path of saying, here's what is not okay. Here's what gets in the way of almost all innovation. It's the same thing that got in the way of what happened with, oh, by the way, that company, we eventually got it to 20 million in sales. We got to 12 million in sales, I think, and we sold it. Didn't make anybody happy that we sold it because we had raised $69 million at that point, and we thought it was $1 billion market, but it was a smaller market, but it wasn't zero. Here's what gets in the way. It's a kind of a funny question. It's like, what gets in the way? You put something into the world and nothing happens. How does that happen? And I would say what's happening is the difference between whether you put something in the world and something happens, or you put something in the world and nothing happens, is a question of whether people can be indifferent to what you're offering them. So it turns out with the eBay situation, people were able to be, my friend Howard at eBay itself could be indifferent. Like it was okay to not buy from us. And I would say if you want to have a way of thinking about it, I think it's a little bit like the way people say, what's the opposite of love? The opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And the difficulty with how you see the world is you can't really imagine that other people will be indifferent to you. So understanding what it feels like, or what does it mean? What's the phenomena of indifference and non-indifference? So if you've ever done anything, now in the medical world, a patient comes into your office and they're in great pain, there's obviously the case that they're not indifferent to you being able to fix them. But in general, understanding what it means for you to introduce something into the world for which there's indifference or non-indifference turns out to be a very important thing to start to think about to recognize that mostly we're making judgments around it. So if it's okay with you, let me start by saying to you this. What does it feel like when there's demand? So what does it feel like when other people are feeling like they have to have what it is you're offering? Or what does it feel like when you yourself are drawn to something? And I want to say I have a pretty good mental model of what it is, or a physical model of what it is. I think what demand feels like is it feels like a whirlpool in a good sense. It feels like a whirlpool in the sense that everything seems to be organized. The environment seems to be organized so that you're going to just follow this path. You can't really escape from it. So in some ways, it's drawing you in. And if anyone has ever been in a situation where they had something like this, and I'm pretty sure that actually in medicine you must feel it directly. This is what it feels like because there's patients lining up outside your door and they won't go away. Is that the whole world is sort of organized to get something from you. Now, in the world of innovation, where it's outside of, let's say, an immediate pain that someone is trying to get you to relieve, you can ask the question, um, can you create demand? So you have some idea for how to fix something or change something to the hospital or provide some services in some way that people aren't currently drawn to get it from you. You could ask, is it possible to create demand? And anyone who's ever been in the startup world will find this slide funny. This is what it feels like when people go to try to create demand. They spend a lot of money. They put a lot of activity into trying to create something that looks like a whirlpool. And then as soon as the money runs out and the boat stops, the whirlpool goes away. So whatever it is this thing which is I'm calling demand, I want to say to you that it's something which is deeper than the kind of surface thing that you do by having a lot of activity that gives the appearance of demand. So now I want to dig into talking for a few minutes about what do we know about demand, because you can start to understand demand in a way that actually can give you some control over this. And it turns out the kind of demand I want to talk about is something we call an authentic demand. An authentic demand, it's going to turn out has a structure to it. And the structure is I'm going to see if I can describe the structure to you this way. First, I'm going to tell you I'm going to tell you a slogan, and I have to share with you that it's only a slogan. If you parse this sentence, which is the slogan is people do what they cannot not do. If you parse this sentence like the way my high school English teacher would have parsed it, she would have said to me, get rid of the double negative, in which case this just says people do what they do. And it tells you nothing. So I want to tell you that to understand authentic demand, there's actually a kind of logic to it. And the logic requires you actually start to be able to think in terms of double negatives. And double negatives are going to turn out to have a meaning, which is not that you can just get rid of them. So in most ways that people think, if you think about like logical things, like they're either true or false, if things are either true or false, then with a double negative, you might as well just erase the double negative, because for something to not be true, it would have to be false. And for something to not be false, it would have to be true. So not would just go away. But it turns out that what we're talking about when we're talking about human beings, we're talking about building things, it's a logic of constructing stuff. And it turns out that in the logic of constructing things, like constructing solutions, constructing physical things, constructing imagery, it turns out in the logic of constructions, you have to you learn to think in terms of things that can be constructed, barriers you can construct to something else being constructed, and barriers you can construct to the construction of barriers. So that's going to turn out to be like you can make something, you can make something that stops someone from making something, or you can stop something which stops somebody from making something that would stop them from making it. I know it sounds complicated, but unfortunately, there's three knots in a row gets you back to one knot, so you don't have to go forever, but you do have to learn to think in terms of uh, saying things, saying that you can't make something, and saying that it's not okay to not do something. So this sentence is going to say, here's what makes someone a customer. What makes them a customer is not buying is not okay. And it also doesn't say, you might read this as saying people do what they have to do. Because as far as I can tell, and you guys probably know this much better than I do, people don't have to do anything. You tell them not to jump off a bridge, they jump off a bridge. You tell them that if that they'll die if they don't take this pill every day and change their lifestyles. Okay, for a few weeks they take the pill and then they don't change their lifestyles. So it's people aren't the kind of beings that have to do anything. So this also doesn't say people do what they have to do, but what it does say is if they say what this does say is here's what indifference is. Indifference is not doing something is not okay. That's indifference. And I'm sorry, that's non-indifference. So indifference is it's okay to not do something. So it's okay for eBay to not buy. That's why they weren't customers. If it was not okay for them to not buy, then they might be a customer. So that's this not principle. And I'm wondering whether I'm going too fast or I'm going at a good pace for you because I can't see anybody's face, but you'll tell me in the questions later. So here's how authentic demands work. And I just want to say that if you, almost all of us seem to naturally think that if we build something, it's inconceivable that people won't use it. But if you go to those people and you show it to them and then they don't use it, you often feel like, well, maybe they just don't understand what I did, or maybe they're too stupid, or maybe they haven't prioritized it. You have all these sort of secondary elaborations about why people aren't doing something, when in fact, what's actually going on is it's actually okay for them to not do something. And what I've now come to understand, and what I find so interesting when I'm talking to people doing innovations is what makes innovations, part of what makes innovation so hard is that everybody you meet turns out to be unbelievably expert at their own lives. And what that means is they wake up in the morning and they know where their keys are, they know who's sleeping next to them, they know where the bathroom is, they know where they're supposed to go. Now, if you got dropped into that situation, you wouldn't know, but they know. And everybody's living their life. In every moment of their life, they kind of know what to do next. That's just how human beings are. That's how our bodies are. That's how our minds are. Now I will say that's not true if someone comes into your office and you say, I'm sorry, you've got a disease that's going to kill you and we have no cure. Okay, in that moment, they don't know what to do. But in most moments, most people's lives, not they know what to do next, which means that if you show up and you offer them something to do in that moment, it turns out that they do have an alternative, which is what they've already been doing. And it was already okay. So the reason you mostly find that people are indifferent is it's okay for them to be indifferent. And so the difficulty of trying to be able to build things for which people are not indifferent is partly the difficulty of trying to see their lives so clearly that you understand them better than they understand themselves, to see how it is that they're stuck somehow. So that's what you discover is that people are living their lives in a series of situations. And in some of those situations, they actually are legitimately stuck. And here's what we mean by stuck. We mean by stuck that everything that they do gets them to some place where they don't want to be. That's what it means to be stuck. And people usually can't even tell you how they're stuck, but they are stuck. And so if you start to see people and start to understand how they're stuck on their own terms, you can start to see, well, okay, I see them on their terms. I see how they're stuck. I can see things that they could do or they could not do that would get them unstuck, and yet they don't do it or they don't stop doing it. And so in some ways, people end up being locked into their situations in which they're stuck. And then the move to make, the opportunity to make, is that you can then introduce something, whether it's a new product, a new service, a new way of looking at something. And in that new way, you end up empowering people to escape. And here's what I'll tell you happens. If you find people in a situation in which they feel stuck and you give them something which they can just reach for that allows them to get out, they do it. That's what authentic demands look like. And it's so much different than trying to convince people of the value of something or trying to convince something that's a good idea or to try to understand why somebody would ever turn down a $150,000 product that would save them $40 million. There's nothing like that. So eBay wasn't stuck. they had lots of ways to save $40 million if that was even something that was meaningful to them. So I don't know how this resonates with you, um, but for sure it's the case that if you find someone in a situation in which you think that you have some value to them and they don't reach for something, chances are there's two possibilities. One is they don't actually, it's okay for them to be the way they are. Actually, it's almost always the case. It's okay for them to be the way they are. And that's what we call the not principle. Okay, so now I want to go on and tell you something else. I have a couple more minutes, but there's two big ideas I want to tell you. The first is how to think about demand and think of it in terms of the not principle. The other is how to organize your own work around innovation. It turns out that once you start to realize that people are who are innovators are confused mostly because they're not noticing what they're not noticing. That is, they're making these judgment errors. You start to notice how it is they go about not noticing things. And once you start to notice how they go about not noticing things, you start to realize, there's three different types of innovation that people are trying to accomplish. And each one has to do with how they go about not noticing or what they're thinking that they're noticing. And the first one, I'll give it to you as an example, but I know I'm talking fast because I'm trying to make it to a place where we can get to some good questions if you have them, unless the people have logged off. I don't see the numbers anymore. Is imagine that you're in the railroad business. And I use this example just because nobody's in the railroad business, but everybody can imagine somebody in the railroad business. You're in the railroad business and someone comes up to you and says, hey, we have a new type of locomotive and it's much cheaper and it's much faster. And you immediately know whether it's a good idea as an innovation. Why? Because you know what it costs to buy these locomotives. You know, thanks you for that. Someone sent me a heart. I like that. It's you know what it's like to buy a locomotive. You know what locomotives cost. You know what the maintenance schedule is. You know when you're going to put your new locomotive in. You kind of immediately know whether it's a useful thing for the business you're in. And in that kind of innovation, here's what is the psychological thing that limits us, or that this would characterize that is if you're in the railroad business, everything shows up as something that makes sense to you in the railroad business as it currently runs. And Aeneas Nin would say that this way, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. If people are doing things in the medical space and you think about the innovations in the medical space, you're just going to experience them in the way that you already think about things. And that's the limitation. This kind of innovation we have a name for. It's like if you're in the railroad business, it's like you have a bucket that captures value. There's certain things that are true about the railroad business. You're running on rails, you're shipping stuff from place to place, you've got certain schedules, all that sort of stuff. You can get better at being in the railroad business by introduce something which doesn't change the business you're in. It just sort of informs your business. It makes your business better, and that's the way to capture value. We call that type of innovation informative. There's going to be three types. The second type of innovation, if I keep this analogy, this story about the railroads going, you might notice one day, hey, while we were running on railroads and building up our running on rails, people built these regional airports, and not only that, there are now nice roads which are paved and there's trucks. Maybe there's a bigger business. Maybe we're assuming that everything that had to go by rail. Maybe we could ship some stuff by air. Maybe we should be in the transportation business, not just in the railroad business. And the CEO stands up and says, "Here's our great idea." By the way, I'm sure this has happened at some hospital you're in. The CEO stands up and says, "Here's a great idea. Here's an assumption we were making. We're going to change the assumption. Maybe it's we're no longer going to treat people here, but we're going to treat them at home, for example." And in this case, the the idea would be let's be in the transportation business. Now, this is a great idea. Everybody stands up and says, let's do it, let's do it. But if you look really closely, you'll see that there's this woman who has the profit and loss responsibility for shipping fruit by rail. And she's saying to everybody, this is a really great idea. But this is going to cut into her ability to be successful because maybe they'll start shipping some of that fruit by air and she won't be so successful. And so she won't even mean to do it. She'll just in some hallway say, you know what, I think it's a really good idea. Let's see if we can make it happen. They'll sort of slow walk it. There's this kind of immune reaction that people have, this psychological immune reaction to this kind of change. But this kind of change, it shows up in the following way. It shows up when someone says, I wonder what assumptions we're making that are assumptions that should change. And it's not so much that you see the world the way you are, it's that the only world that you can describe is the world that you can describe. So we don't describe the world we see the world we can describe. And that type of innovation we call transformative. And I want to tell you that one thing we've learned from all this, once you start to see what's going on there, is in a transformative innovation, you're asking people to become better at being in the world, but not by being who they are. In the informative case, you're asking them to get better at being in the world the way they already are. And the transformative case, you're asking them to change who they are to get better, and people are incredibly resistant to that psychologically. So we actually recommend against that. The third type of innovation, so we have informative and transformative. The third type of innovation is you ask yourself the question, I wonder where the idea for a railroad came from in the first place. Like, where did the bucket come from at all? In the railroad case, you could say, you know what, you're in the railroad business. Here's something you'd never noticed if you're in the railroad business. Some people are getting onto your trains once a year to go to meetings across the country. Once you started having buses, they started going to meetings across the state once a month. But you know what? They don't need to actually get in the train or in the bus to go somewhere. They just want to talk to each other. But you're in the railroad business, which means you own all the right of ways. So you can run wires between them, and you can now have them talk 10 times a day. And now you can go into the communications business, which, by the way, is a bigger business than the transportation business. And that meets no immunities to change. That's just a way of rearranging how the world looks to see what was already always there, for which not doing something was not okay, but you never thought of it that way because you were always stuck with thinking that you either had to move somebody someplace. First, you thought you had to move them on rails, then you thought you had to move them at all, and then you realized you didn't have to move them at all. So that type of innovation we call formative. And here's what gets in the way there. It's I love this little poem. The range of what we think and do is limited by what we fail to notice. And because we fail to notice that we fail to notice, there's little you can do to change until we notice how failing to notice shapes our thoughts and deeds. So in many ways, my message to you is going to be this. What's in our way in innovation is that we're not noticing that we're not noticing. We're not noticing the opportunities, and we're not noticing the threats to the opportunities. And while you might think, well, what am I going to do about that? Because that's like saying work on the unknowns. That you can't work on, but this you can work on. And the reason you can work on this is because the mechanisms by which human beings don't notice, those are observable. Those are cognitive errors that you can notice. You can notice how people are not noticing. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. You know that they're wrong or right. You just notice that they can be wrong because they're not noticing that they're not noticing something. This type of innovation, just to give it a name, is called formative. And I want to give you, let me see if I can specialize it or make it particular. No, I'm not a physician. My wife's a physician, which just means I have more time to myself than I would like to have sometimes. So I know nothing except to be dangerous in the medical world. Here's a situation a person finds themselves in. She's an expert at reading, assuming those are X-rays of some sort. And now all of a sudden the world changes. Now, when does innovation happen? It often happens when there's some external thing that shows up, like AI shows up. Now what? Well, what's an informative move to make? Okay, you don't change what people do, you just make them better at what they currently do. What would that look like? Well, that might mean you build software which allows them to read these things better. And so you introduce that. That's an informative innovation. You can do, most of the time, people are very happy to be better at what they currently do without changing how they go about it. You could introduce informative innovations. I would say 85% of the successful innovations are going to be informative anyway. Okay, but now what's transformative look like? It's the same situation. Person's job, life is to read X-rays. AI shows up. What are the assumptions you're making that you might be able to make something bigger, better, more? That's some assumption. Here's an assumption. Why are we having people read them at all? Why don't you just get rid of the people and have it all be by AI? Well, I'm pretty sure if any of you have tried this, that you're going to meet a lot of immunities to change. People are going to say, well, they'll never have judgment, or I don't know how I'm going to trust them, or there's no liability. There's going to be all these things which are, even though it might be the right thing to do, there are all these things in which human beings are just going to get in the way. And this is why we're recommending that transformative innovations where people get better, but they have to be different than who they are. Those are extraordinarily difficult to introduce into the world, and we're not recommending them at all. Or if you're going to introduce them, you have to worry a lot about trying to get people to change, which is, I don't know about you, but I've seen people go to therapy for many years and spend a lot of money, and they still, 20 years later, they're talking about how much they want to change. Okay, so the third type of innovation, same situation. Now the question is, the AI shows up. Now the question is not to make people better at their jobs, not to change some assumption, but to say what's going on here in the first place. And what's going on here in the first place, that was always the case, is that there's somebody out there that has some illness or some possibility of illness, and they want to figure out what that is. Maybe you don't have to do that with X-rays at all. Maybe you don't have to do that with people reading X-rays. Maybe some technology shows up that allows you to just put something on people's wrists that monitors them and gives you the answer separately. That's a kind of formative move. That's like the move of introducing the idea of communications to the railroad business. The issue was always there. That is, the not was always there. It was not okay to not know what to do about this thing that you're struggling with. But the way you thought to do it might be different. It might be something that people would just reach for because they could escape in another way. Okay, so that's the story. And I want to tell you, just do a quick summary. There's authentic demand, not principle. It's so helpful just to ask yourself the question. Everybody's trying to tell me this is a really good thing we should work on. Just take a minute and ask the question, is it okay to not do it? Is it okay for your customers to not reach for it? And if the answer is yes, then you really have to think hard about what the heck you're doing. Okay, and I want to tell you there's three types of innovation. And it's super helpful when you're doing innovation to ask yourself, well, we're trying to figure out something which addresses something which was always there, but we've been doing it in some other way? Are we trying to do something which is just getting people to be better at what they already do? Or are we doing something which is going to change people's assumptions and thereby risk the possibility that they're going to be immunities to change around it? The reason that these three turn out to be important is once we came to the understanding that there were three different types of innovation, we started to look at the tools people used. Tools like design thinking or iteration or change management. So all these tools, and it turns out that some of the tools work in some of these approaches, but some of the tools don't work at all in some of these approaches. For example, almost none of the existing tools work for formative, and yet formative is what's the most interesting thing to do from a startup point of view or from a disruptive kind of innovation point of view. Okay, so now I'll end with this. I hope this is connecting back to you. As I said, this is meant to meet you where you might feel as though your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger ought to meet. And I would say, where's the best place to start? And in our experience, the best place to start is actually with yourself and ask yourself, in this situation where you're innovating, what's not okay for you about not innovating? And that gives you a sort of guiding path as you look at others and try to understand how is it that they can be indifferent to your own not. There's a lot to learn there. So I'll say this, you should read the book. I think my partner and I are writing a second book to follow on because there's a lot we've learned about how to actually do these things. We have a center here at Georgia Tech called the Center for Deliberate Innovation that's set up in such a way to be able to partner with people on their own innovation journeys. And our greatest hope is to start to make these tools and these ways of thinking available to others so that we can unleash much more innovation. For what it's worth, I didn't want to say this at the beginning, but relative to startups, we've implemented this work with startups, and we've generated an incredible amount of dollar wealth and jobs in ways that look to me and look to others very different than the way people have gone about doing these things before. It turns out you waste a lot less time when you can know that what you're doing is not okay for someone to not buy or not reach for. So I think I should pause there and stop there. And I thank you for listening to me rush through this breathlessly.
Thank you, Dr. Furst. I think that was a wonderful overview of some of the systematic ways of thinking about innovation. Sorry, I'm getting a little echo. There we go. So just wanted to dive in and talk a little bit more about as some of the questions start to come in. You know, I think as I've looked at it, I've seen, like you, hundreds of startups kind of with all the energy go into this space of healthcare over the last kind of 15 years and really just go after it, right? And just use all of their energy, much to perhaps the chagrin of their spouse, as you kind of alluded to, or friends or family, whatever it might be, and then really kind of, again, deliver a nice product, but a product that ultimately, kind of like your experience, doesn't actually become a not. So I'm curious, given that you've provided this framework for us, if you could just tell us a little bit more on your experience perceiving the nots and how do you really get to that place as an innovator?
Uh, it's a s- it's a really good question. I'll tell you the experience we have, and it'll be a disturbing experience to share, unfortunately. So 100% of the time, when people have started with us and they've said, "Here's what I think is a product that would be a good idea," or "Here's what I think people need that we should make." So far, 100% of the time, there was no authentic demand, or if there was authentic demand, it was really tiny. Um, and so our work has turned out to feel a lot like science. I'll just share what it feels like with science. It feels like, as a scientist, you come to realize that your job is to try to figure out what's real. And you start out thinking that something's real, and then the world tells you that it's not real. And then you try to figure out, well, there's still something here that might be real, and then you think something else might be real, and you do the work and you discover, well, that's not real. It's this kind of weird winnowing process of I call it the negative space. You have to keep subtracting. So you're pretty sure that this person or this group of people have authentic demand in their situation. It's kind of unimaginable that they don't. And yet everything you show up with, they actually reveal to you that they're indifferent to it. And so the work is to keep putting in place what are like our kind of experiments or what we call documented primary interactions. It's a kind of field work to start to see the situations that they're living in, and in order to understand how it is that they can be indifferent to this thing that seems obvious they shouldn't be indifferent to. And when you do that, it's this weirdly subtractive process. I think what people try to do is they try to imagine something that they could make that would cause someone to be interested in it. And when they do that, they almost always start to suffer from something called there's demand characteristics and confirmation bias. They almost always go to someone and say, "Wouldn't it be great if I could do this for you?" Like that's what I did with Howard Schmidt. Is I went and said, "Wouldn't it be great if you could save $40 million?" And they said, "Yes, it'd be really great." And so all the signals were convincing me that what I was doing was a good idea. What I wasn't doing was trying to convince myself that it wasn't a good idea by, for example, saying to them, what would it be okay to not buy it? Because if they had told me the answer to that was yes, then I should have really worried about whether making it was a good idea. In the end, when people do this work, it's this very process oriented, not sort of jumping to conclusions thing where you show people how to do the work, you show them what you need to find, that is what would make a situation be such that not buying is not okay. And almost always what happens is in the first little while, they eventually discover that everything that they thought was really not going to be an authentic demand. And then they start again and they try to see the situation in some more legitimate terms to see why it is that people were able to be indifferent to that, but couldn't be indifferent to something else. And this weird thing happens so far every time so I would say a third to a half of the people that we work with, they end up finding an authentic demand. And when they find it, it's almost invariably something that is really sounds stupid on the face of it. It's like it was always there. It was some really small thing. And the fact that it was small turns out to make it a really big opportunity because for this demand to exist, the situation only had to have this little thing in it. And then it turns out lots of situations have that little thing in it. And yeah, so it's this kind of subtractive process that you go through.
That's great. Thank you. I would just add, sorry, maybe just mute.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we've got another question here from the audience. Can you share some examples of companies you've built or helped build that provided a product service that helped unlock people who felt that stuck phenomenon? In particular, how you managed to identify the not principles in those examples. Um,
Yes, I can do that. The other thing I'm just going to say, just to give you something to hold on to, if you want to make a note about this, psychologists have figured out that if you know these two things about people, it helps you a lot. It also helps you know about yourself. People tend to jump to conclusions. They see a small example and they just sure that they're right. I jumped to the conclusion that $40 million saved would be something they would buy. And then people are also biased against disconfirming evidence. And so what constructs this waking dream is that everybody you're talking to has already jumped to a conclusion about how things work, and everything that might convince them otherwise, they're just biased against it. So a lot of the work is just to put in place a process that helps people manage around those two sort of psychological problems. I think the company that might be easiest to relate to in this audience is a company called Florence Healthcare. It's a company that started with someone who was in the medical publishing business and had been successful at that before, a very good technologist and a physician who knew something about clinical research that was being done at Emory. And they had an idea that at the time, big pharmas were who were running these research programs in these contract research organizations were possibly losing a lot of money because they didn't have accurate, timely information about how the trials were going. That there might be chief financial officers at these pharmas that if only they knew how bad the results were that were coming in, they might cut off the trials early. No, I don't want to talk about whether that's good science or not. I just want to say that they had talked to people at pharmas, and the pharmas were feeling as though they had to put PhDs onto airplanes to go fly to the contract research place to then pour through papers to try to figure out whether or not their studies were going fast, and that if only they could speed up that information flow, there would be a lot of money saved and drugs coming to market faster. So that was where our this company Florence started, and their idea was to put iPads in the hands of the people that were collecting the data, and they're going to have the iPads pull the stuff together and ship it up, and there's no demand for any of that. And digging into this, they started to show up in the offices where the people were gathering the data, and they saw that in those offices, people were using EHRs, these health records, and they couldn't actually use the data from the health records, so they were printing stuff out, and they would print stuff out, and then they would have to redact it by hand with these big black markers, and then paper would pile up in these offices from floor to ceiling, and everybody was complaining that the paper was piling up in the office, and then they discovered that it sounded really good to get rid of all the paper in the office, but then nobody would buy it. In fact, there were already companies out there trying to do paper reduction. They couldn't, there was no authentic demand for that. And then it turns out that they watched these people and they found that these people not only were having to redact by hand, which is definitely not something that they were drawn to do, but they also were chasing physicians around the hospital, and physicians weren't even coming into the hospital because they had to get them to sign off on these kinds of things. And it turns out, you know what? Not having the things redacted and not having physicians sign off, that's not okay. And the way that they're going about it is not how these people are. They're not the kind of people that want to sit all there all day redacting. They're the people who want to gather the data and send it off. They're also not the kind of people that want to run around the hospital, try to figure out where some doctor is and interrupt them when they're patients to get the sign off. Okay, so our guys came in and seeing that, produced a system called an e-binder, which you can use at these contract sites. And they didn't say, by the way, you don't have to chase the doctors. And they didn't say, by the way, you don't have to do redactions. But they knew that those two things would be unbelievable draws to anybody who saw it. But they showed them this, and they said, and see all that paper there? We're going to save you all the money on all those papers, and it's going to happen much faster. I think they're now in something like 30,000 trial sites worldwide, and now because they're in so many sites, the pharmas are all trying to buy data from them in some fashion. So the point is, it's such a stupid, simple little thing that not having it's not okay, but it actually unlocks everything. I mean, you wouldn't walk in thinking I'm going to give you something that redacts, nobody would buy it. But if you start to see what it makes it and not, that's what happens.
Yeah, I love that. It's a great answer. I think we actually have a bunch of other questions. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have time for, but we'll try and feed them to Dr. Furst and maybe get you an answer in the follow-up. But it's just been such a pleasure. Again, I think you've really, many of us have written a lot or read a lot of books on innovation, and I think this really added another lens of insight to me personally, and really appreciate what you've done to really advance the science in the space and get us to think really a lot more about authentic demand and building products that really will have the kind of impact that we all dream of when we start this in a garage. So thanks again for your time, Dr. Furst, and really look
Thank you.
forward to following up.
Jared, thank you so much. Eric, Raul, thank you for the organization. Paula, thanks. Everybody in the audience, thank you so much. I really appreciated this. And for me, the best follow-up, first of all, if you want to read the book, that's great. We don't make any money on the book. There's like 4 authors and people don't make any money in publishing. But we're very interested in having people know about these things. That's my not is it's not okay for me to watch people spilling money and wasting time and then the customers are nothing's happening. It seems really super painful once you start to see this. And so I'm very much drawn to that. We do have the Center of Deliberate Innovation at Georgia Tech. We have other people besides me working on this. Um, Eric Randerston, who's on here, is helping to set up a new company to help people who want to actually do things which are commercial. And if you want to do things which are nonprofit, we're also interested in that at the center. Anyway, nice to meet you all, and I hope this is at least, if not getting in touch with us is okay, then don't get in touch with us. So I'll see
No,
you all.
great leads. Great leads. Thanks again.
Thank
Okay,
you, Merrick.
bye
Thank you so
everyone.
much.